Hello, my name is Mark Yeager. I'm going to spend a few minutes talking about regulation of human inflammation by the endogenous hormone cortisol, which we all secrete on a daily basis. The background for this comes out of the modern intensive care unit, where the most common cause of death is patients who have a major systemic inflammatory event. And the question has been for decades now how cortisol regulates systemic inflammation in humans and whether it might be used as a therapeutic agent. And despite decades of work, we really don't still have any answer for that. And so the question that our group has asked, and the researchers that I work with, Alan Monk and Paul Guyer, and that we presented today at the conference, is whether or not cortisol might have not only the classic anti-inflammatory effects that are well known by all practitioners and lay people alike, but whether there might be stimulatory effects from cortisol as well. And so we undertook a study to examine the potential effects of cortisol throughout a wide range of in vivo cortisol concentrations and then measure the inflammatory response. What we did was we got healthy human volunteers and gave them one of three treatments. One was a placebo, a control. A second treatment was an intermediate concentration or dose of cortisol, the same cortisol that your body produces on a daily basis. And the third was a very high concentration of cortisol. And we gave the treatments intravenously, and we gave them for 6 hours from 9 a.m. to 3 p.m. on day one of the study. So 12 people in each of the three groups. One group got a placebo, one got an intermediate dose of hydrocortisone or cortisol, and a third got a very high dose of cortisol. On the next day, the subjects were brought back to the hospital, and we gave them a systemic inflammatory stimulus. We used bacterial endotoxin intravenously at a dose of 2 nanograms per kilogram. And what you see when you inject endotoxin is a very stereotypical development of a systemic inflammatory state that lasts about 8 hours or so, and it's characterized by release of pro-inflammatory mediators early on into the peripheral blood, followed by a lesser release of anti-inflammatory mediators. What we found very interestingly was that the intermediate dose of cortisol, when the subjects who were treated on day one with an intermediate dose of hydrocortisone or cortisol, had the highest pro-inflammatory response on the next day to an inflammatory stimulus. Whereas the group that got a placebo on day one, or the group that got a high dose of hydrocortisone on day one, had much lower levels of pro-inflammatory cytokine mediators. We were looking at interleukin-6. In addition, when we looked at anti-inflammatory mediators, interleukin-10, there was a U-shaped curve such that the group that got the intermediate dose of hydrocortisone on day one had lower levels of the anti-inflammatory mediator interleukin-10, whereas the placebo and the high-dose group had higher levels of interleukin-10. And then interestingly, when we broke this down even further, we went back and looked at the individual, the concentrations of cortisol that were achieved individually in each participant on day one at the end of their 6-hour infusion. So we asked, well, what was the relationship between the cortisol concentration that we achieved on day one with our 6-hour infusion to the pro-inflammatory response that we saw the next day on day two. And what we found was what looked like a very clear evidence of a bell-shaped curve, so that all the individual points, when you put them together, built into an inverted U-shape, or we would call it a bell-shaped curve, with those individuals whose concentrations were in the middle range had the highest pro-inflammatory response to cortisol. So in summary, what we found was that there is not a simple linear dose response or concentration response relationship between cortisol and inflammation. Cortisol is not simply an anti-inflammatory agent. When you insert a time interval between exposure to cortisol and a subsequent inflammatory stimulus, what you in fact find is the relationship between cortisol and inflammation is much more complex and is best depicted by a bell-shaped or an inverted U-shaped curve.